In this presentation, we're going to talk about how plants transport water and nutrients. So we're going to first start by talking about these stone plants. And these are tiny plants that live out in the desert. And when fully grown, their leaf diameter ranges anywhere between 1 to 2 inches. So the vast majority of their plant structure is buried underground, except for these tiny leaves that are exposed to the hot, dry desert air. And this kind of structure has definite advantages and disadvantages. For example, the advantage will be that they can reduce water loss because their leaf surface area is so small. But the same feature gives them a disadvantage because since their leaf surface area is so small, they can't absorb as much sunlight. And that means that they can't photosynthesize as much. So that essentially means that they can't make much food for themselves. So the stone plants do a really nice job at presenting the dilemma that's faced by all plants on the surface of Earth. So all plants need to make a decision. Do I increase my photosynthetic efficiency to make more food for myself, or do I reduce water loss? So the ways to increase photosynthetic efficiency will be increasing the leaf surface area by having larger, broader leaves. Ways to reduce water loss will be the opposite. You need to decrease the leaf surface area. And you do that by having small or even spiny leaves. And as you can see, these two are mutually exclusive solutions to their problems, so you can't have both. So for all plants, they need to make a fine balance between these two needs that they have. And what needs they prioritize largely depends on where they live. So let's take a look at some examples. So here are some of the world's smallest and largest leaves found on the surface of Earth. So as you can see, some of these are super tiny. They literally look like dots. And these guys, they prioritize conserving water, right? So that means that their natural habitat is limited in water. So their first priority need is to conserve water. Whereas this one shown on this picture right here, the leaf size is enormous. It's bigger than this fully grown man. So their need is to photosynthesize, right? Increase their photosynthetic efficiency so that they can grow, they can reproduce. So that implies that in their natural habitat, water availability is not limited. Okay, so before we start talking about the details of how plants transport water and minerals, let's talk about plant anatomy. So all plants are made up of the two systems. The shoot system refers to the part that sits above the ground. So the shoot system has all of these functions: photosynthesis to make food for themselves, reproduce. The reproductive organ for plants is flower. And they're involved in storing, transporting water and nutrients, as well as secreting hormones for specific physiological responses. The root system sits below the ground, and their main function is to anchor the plant so that the plant can be supported without toppling over. They are also responsible for absorbing water and minerals from the soil, as well as some nitrogen. And the root system is also involved in storage, transport, and hormone secretion and production as well. Plants have 3 different layers of tissues: dermal, ground, and vascular. Let's talk about the role of each. The dermal tissue refers to the outermost layer that's shown in this picture, and their role is to protect the plant from external damages and also preventing water loss. The ground tissue refers to the middle layer of tissue that's shown in this picture here, and their role is metabolism. So they do photosynthesis, they do cellular respiration. They basically allow the plants to grow and reproduce and maintain homeostasis. They're also involved in storing of water and nutrients. The vascular tissues, which we're going to talk about a lot in this presentation, is involved in transporting water and sugar. And it's made up of 2 different types of tubing called xylem and phloem. Xylem is involved in water transport. Phloem is involved in sugar transport. So trees are pretty amazing because they can carry about 200 gallons of water per day without having any muscles or heart. So my question to you is, how do you think they achieve this? So here are two choices that you can choose from. Choice number one, water is pushed upward from the roots. Choice number two, water is pulled upward by the leaves. So these two choices differ in where is this whole process starting. This is saying water is pushed up from the roots down here. This is saying water is pulled up by the leaves, right, up there. So I want you to pause and make your selection now. And watch the rest of the presentation to check whether your guess was correct or not. So here's an overview diagram. And this shows how water, along with sugar and other nutrients, are transported within the plant. So let's start with number one, down in the roots. The roots are responsible for taking up water and minerals. Then water and dissolved minerals will move up the plant through the xylem tubing. And it's going to eventually reach the leaves. Once they reach the leaves, water molecules will be evaporating off of the plant leaf through stomata. Another thing that happens up in the leaves is photosynthesis. In the leaves, there are these tiny pores called stomata, and stomata are the holes through which carbon dioxide can enter and water molecules can exit the plant. And the absorbed carbon dioxide will be used to make food, sugar for the plants. And some of that sugar will be transported throughout the plant through another type of tubing called phloem. So that's the overview of what kind of materials are transported and how and where. So now let's zoom into the transport that happens in the roots. We're going to focus in the second picture right here, which is showing a cross-section of the root. And all plant roots have numerous root hairs, which kind of look like projections. And all these root hairs function so that they can increase the overall surface area through which water and dissolved minerals can enter the plant. And once water enters through the root hair cell, they can take one of three different routes to reach the xylem tubing and therefore the rest of the plant. So let's talk about each one here. I'm going to draw the third route here. Okay, so the first one, shown in green, this is referred to as the symplastic route. And this describes how water travels from one cell to the next. And when they cross from one cell to the next, they travel through these little holes that exist between plant cells called plasmodesmata. That's symplastic route. The one that's shown in purple, this one right here, is the apoplastic route. And you can notice that water is traveling along the cell wall. It's not actually entering any of the cells. It's just speeding along the cell wall. And that represents a faster movement of water. The third one is a mix of both that's shown in red. So this is the transmembrane route. And as you can see, it is traveling from one cell to the next, but it's also traveling through the cell wall as well. So it's like a mixture of symplastic and apoplastic route. But regardless of which route it takes, all water will be forced into traveling through a symplastic route once they encounter something called a Casparian strip. A Casparian strip is a waxy layer of tissue that forces water to move into the cell. That way, these plant cells can regulate what actually goes in to the vascular tissue because it wants to filter out any unnecessary materials or toxins or potentially harmful things. Okay, so now we're going to move our way up a little bit. Let's talk about what happens in the stem. So here is a little schematic diagram. And now the type of tubing that's in your stem is called xylem. And xylem is an empty, hollow tubing made up of dead cells. Okay? And this is just a passageway through which water and dissolved minerals can be transported within the plant. If you zoom into the xylem wall, you can actually see all these water molecules sticking to the xylem wall itself through adhesion. Remember, adhesion describes how water molecules are sticking to other materials. In this case, the xylem cell wall is made up of a hydrophilic cellulose, which is a type of sugar. So water molecules can easily stick to the xylem wall. And this is important because adhesion of water molecules to the xylem wall prevents them from slipping downward due to gravity. And you can also notice that all these water molecules are sticking to one another through cohesion. Remember, cohesion refers to how water molecules stick to each other. Through cohesion, all these water molecules are connected in one continuous long chain. And that chain extends all the way up in the leaf, all the way down to the roots. So, due to the adhesion and cohesion of water, all these water molecules within the xylem tubing are traveling in a kind of like beads on a string kind of fashion in one continuous chain. And that's an important part that I want you to remember before we start talking about what happens up in the leaves. Okay, so now let's move up to the leaves. Up on the leaves, you have tiny pores called stomata. These are shown in green. Stomata, again, refers to these pores that you find on the underside of the leaf, and their function is to allow gas exchange. So specifically, carbon dioxide enters the plant through stomata and water exits out of the plant through stomata. So the first step that happens in the stomata is water molecules will exit. It's going to evaporate into the air through stomata. As some of these water molecules are leaving, they're going to pull on the next water molecule that's connected in this continuous chain. Remember, when we talked about the stem, we talked about the cohesion and adhesion of water, which allows all these water molecules to travel in one continuous, like linear chain-like fashion. So when some water molecules leave, that will pull on the next water molecule and the next water molecule and the next water molecules to be pulled up as well. So this results in an overall movement of water from an area of high water potential to low water potential. So the area of high water potential will be down in the roots, and the area of low water potential will be up on the leaves because water is constantly being lost and water will move towards that direction. So we call this force the transpirational pull. As more and more water molecules are lost up in the leaf, that will further decrease the water potential in this area, allowing more and more water molecules to be pulled up against gravity. So if you actually compare the water potential up in the leaves versus the one in the root, you can see that this is a lower negative number. This is -7 megapascal, whereas the water potential in the roots is only -0.6 megapascal. Okay, so now let's zoom into what is actually happening within the stomata. The way that plants open and close stomata is through using a pair of cells called guard cells. And these guard cells surround the stomata. So stomata refers to the actual hole, and guard cells are the cells that surround that hole. And guard cells' job is to control when and how stomata open and close. So let's talk about how stomata gets opened. If you look at the first picture, the first step is that potassium ions will be pumped in. And all these extra solute particles accumulating in the guard cells that will reduce the water potential within the guard cell. And that causes more water molecules to enter as well. And all that extra water entering the guard cells will make the guard cells turgid. It makes it swell. And that swelling causes the stomata to open. There are some specific environmental triggers that can cause this response. Blue light, depletion or decrease in the CO2 level within the leaf space, and also just the natural circadian rhythm that's found in plants. So So most plants open their stomata during the day and they close their stomata during the night. Okay, in order to close the stomata, the exact opposite needs to happen. So potassium ions will leave the cell and water molecules will follow. So all that loss of water will cause the guard cells to become flaccid. And that closes the stomata, which means that carbon dioxide can no longer enter and water can no longer exit the stomata. That usually happens during the night for most plants. Okay, we're going to skip over these. We're going to talk about that in class. Okay, now I'm going to briefly talk about translocation. Now, remember, transpiration refers to how water is transported within the plant. Translocation refers to how sugar is transported within the plant. In order to understand how this process works, you have to understand these two terms. Sugar source refers to any plant organ that is a net producer of sugar. What it means is that it makes more sugar than it consumes. So sugar source organ will be the leaves because leaves are the site of photosynthesis. This is where sugar is made. And they typically use up less sugar than the amount of sugar that they make. Sugar sink refers to any plant organ that is a net consumer of sugar. So growing roots, growing buds, growing stems, and fruits, they are the sugar sinks. So here's a schematic diagram of how sugar molecules are moved around within the phloem tubing. So everything starts at the source cell. Here's the plant source. Again, an example of a source cell will be like a leaf, right? That actually does photosynthesis. So all that sugar molecules that are made from a source cell will enter the phloem tubing. This is the phloem tubing. And all that solute particles, all that sugar molecules entering the phloem tubing, it will decrease the water potential within that area, within the phloem tubing. What that does is it causes water molecules to enter from the xylem tubing. Remember, water always flows from an area of high water potential to low water potential. So now all that sugar molecules is making the water potential of that area really low. So that forces all these water molecules to enter from the xylem tubing. So this tubing shown in red, that's the xylem tubing that we've been talking about, right? So water molecules are physically moving from the xylem tubing into the phloem tubing. And that in turn increases the water potential. So that water needs to travel somewhere. It can travel up or down depending on what the plants need. But in this case, it's showing how the plant in this case, it's showing how those water and dissolved sugar is moving downward. So now let's talk about what happens in the sink cell. So here's a sink cell that consumes more sugar than it makes. So things like growing roots, growing buds, fruits, all of these are sink cells. So the first step is a lot of these sugar molecules will move into the sugar sink cell, and that is by active transport, meaning things are moved against the concentration gradient from an area of low concentration to high concentration, right, using ATP at the expense of ATP. And all those solutes leaving the phloem tubing, it will increase the water potential again, okay? And that causes some water molecules to move back into the xylem tubing. So as you can see, the way that sugar is transported within the phloem tubing involves the interplay between the phloem and the xylem. One last thing, there's another interesting function of the phloem. In addition to transporting sugar, it also transports other types of macromolecules. But more interestingly, phloem is involved in the whole plant communication. So various signals, including the signals that result in the production of flowers, or the ones that starts up the whole immune response in plant, those signals travel within the phloem. Another thing is that the phloem is used for electrical signaling as well. So electrical signals also travel within the phloem. So in the case of Venus flytrap, it can actually sense a prey sitting on the leaf, and electrical signals will be sent down the plant to cause the leaf to curl up whenever there is a prey sitting on the leaf. So that's another interesting function of the phloem. So that's it for this presentation. Make sure you take thorough notes and bring any questions to class.